Hello chess friends, in this video we are going to look at a brilliant chess endgame played between two legends of our game, Alexander Alekhine as black and Jose Raul Capablanca as white. So Capablanca is white here, as you can see he's a pawn up, here's the extra pawn, can he win it? So let's see what happens. This is an absolutely phenomenal game. So without any further ado, let's get started. This game was played in, this was the 29th match game played in Buenos Aires in 1927. So this was one of their World Championship games, the 29th one. And it's simply a piece of art. It's a beautiful masterpiece. So let's go forward and let's dive into it. So white as Capablanca here played rook to c6. And after rook c7, here we have an exchange of rooks. And basically we reach this position. I want you to go ahead, assess the position and try to come up who is better and can white really win in this position. So if you want, you can pause the video. I'll just go ahead and explain you what is exactly happening over here. So first things first, white is obviously a pawn up. That's something to be considered. But apart from that, white has a real chance of winning because he has a knight. So we know that queen coordinates best with a knight, and that's the reason white having a queen and knight is preferable and better than having a queen and bishop. Also, the knight can actually jump onto e5 and attack the vulnerable f7 point. Apart from that, there is if you just go into an endgame and exchange queens, this endgame would still be slightly preferable for white, and that is the reason white is slightly better here. First things first, because of the extra pawn and because of the queen and knight coordination. So white has some chances of winning this endgame, although it's not very clear. It's not easy at all, specifically when you're facing a opponent which is of Alexander's class. You know, Alexander was a fantastic player and he went on to become the next world champion. He defeated Capablanca and rightfully became the next world champion. He was very hardworking, he's determined, he was a great genius. But this game was won by Capablanca by simply brilliant plays. So let's see what happens here. White in this position first put his knight on e5. That's an excellent square for the knight. And after bishop 2, after so just a second, after knight e5, bishop g7 was played, and now white plays queen to a8 check, basically forcing black to put his king on h7. Bishop to f8 is really passive, and then something like queen to e8 could have been played, and tying all of black's pieces on the f7 point would have been really dangerous, and that's the reason king h7 was played. Now there are a few things which has to be noticed over here. The white queen is actually placed on the excellent diagonal and is taking control. Oh, pardon me for that, that's a misfire. Yeah, the queen is placed on this excellent diagonal and is taking care that there is no check to the white king. So queen is controlling all the very important squares over here and keeping control over the position. That is very important, to keep control over the position. So white in this position put his knight back, and now you can see white has a plan. There are some positions where you need to wait, whereas there are other positions where you need to do something proactively. So this is the position where you need to constantly create threats, and that is one of the important things that you can learn from this game, is creating threats. So what is the threat? White would like to play h4, knight to g5 check, followed by something like queen to g8, and you can see there will be a mate on h7 threatened. That is already the plan of white. White is having a very concrete and interesting plan. How is black going to tackle? It seems that black does not have any active chances. So let's see what happens next. So yeah, knight to f3, bishop to f6, just taking control of the dark squares and stopping any knight to g5 move. So whenever knight appears on the dark squares, he will basically swap off the piece, and you know that will be okay for him. So how are we going to continue here? The thing is, we needs to keep making threats, and white plays an excellent move here. He plays queen to a6. Now this move comes with a very strong threat. Can you know it? Can you identify the threat? Yes, you can see loose pieces drop off. The bishop on f6 is actually a tactical threat, tactically loose, and white is actually planning to go d5. And if black pawn captures, then you can see queen can capture the bishop. Otherwise we are going to capture on e6, and after f takes we have damaged his structure, which will always be better for white. So now he plays king to g7, protecting the bishop, and in this case pushing forward with d5 doesn't really make sense, because now he's going to capture and he'll be a pawn up. So how does white continue from here? Again, if you want, you can pause the video and try to find the continuation that Capablanca played here. It is simply brilliant. White needs to constantly create threats, and here he played queen to d3. This comes with a threat. He would very much like to play e3, e4, and then he will have choice. He can play e5, or he can also play d5 and get a passed pawn on the d file. That is one of his two plans, and actually now black cannot do much. He just cannot do much here. He doesn't have too much of potential to of mobility. His pieces are quite fixed. So in this position he played queen to b7. Does that stop us from doing what we want? Absolutely not. So Capablanca went on to play e4, and after queen to c6, just a simple move by Capablanca h3. This kind of little moves are always typical of players like Karpov, Capablanca, Petrosian. They keep making these little moves, and they are just teasing their opponent. What have you got? You cannot do anything active. So I'm just going ahead and going to improve my position slightly, and that just doesn't harm my position, but in fact just questions you, what are you going to do? So black does not have anything active here. He just steps aside with his queen, and here we go. We play d5. So one of the things I learned from this game is constantly creating threats. Even if there are minimum amount of pieces, right now you have got a queen, a knight, a bishop, and a few pawns, but still you can create a huge amount of threats, and that is always what you should do. So white is already threatening to go forward and just push forward with his pawn. So this was taken, and white already has a passed pawn. This is something to be looked forward to. So white is now, although is still slightly better, and there is still huge chances of a draw here. I think white has created something real out of his position. So here we go, queen to c3. Should you exchange the queens, or would you avoid it? Well, the general answer would be you should avoid exchanging queens, as the bishop on f6 is quite powerful, and he won't let the pawn easily go forward. So generally you should avoid queen exchanges. In the game, Capablanca took the queen, which is actually a somewhat of a mistake, because generally you don't want to exchange queens. But even this was beautifully followed up. We are going to go into that, but let us see what happens if what is white's best continuation. White should actually play queen to d1, just keeping an eye on the pawn. And now something like queen to a1. Black is saying, do you want to exchange the queens? We are going to say no, we do not want to exchange the queens, we are not interested. And after something like queen to b2, we just reject the offer with queen to e4. Now these squares are poisoned. Obviously knight controls those squares, queen cannot go for the exchanges. But even here, I think this is the reason Capablanca avoided this, because it's not very clear how white is going to win. You cannot just straightforward push the pawn, because then that becomes a liability, that becomes a weakness, and it's not very clear again. So maybe that is the reason Capablanca went for the more clearer way of playing. He just exchanged queens, which although makes the game more drawish, but still he has a very concrete idea in his mind, which turned out to be brilliant. So I would not dare to criticize Capablanca, because the follow-up is simply brilliant. So bishop takes queen. What is the idea? Why did we exchange queens? Isn't it difficult to push forward the pawn? After all, the king is very close. The plan is, white has a plan, of course. He wants to bring his king from f1 all the way to c4, and basically the king will act as a shepherd and help push forward the pawn, and basically that will win up a piece, the bishop, of course. So white goes with king f1, very logical. King to f6, king to e2. Currently the black king cannot go towards the pawn, both of these squares are covered, but here he plays bishop to b4, and here comes the point. If you like, just pause the video and try to find the solution. It's a beautiful move again. So Capablanca here played knight to d4. It's simply a marvelous move. King to e5 is, now you can see there is a trick. Knight to c6 will be a fork, and black will lose the bishop. So what happens if he just goes to e7? In that case, again, knight to c6 is a fork, winning the bishop, and that is the reason black can't really come forward, cannot come close. All of these squares are poisoned. So here he plays bishop to c5, very logical move, and white goes forward and plays knight to c6. And here you see the point of all of these moves. This is the setup he had in mind when Capablanca was aiming for the queen exchange. The pawn controls these squares and the knight controls these two squares, basically creating a wall, a very beautiful wall, and black king cannot go forward and attack the white pawn. So here he plays Just a second. Pardon me for that. Yeah, knight to c6. Here he played king to f5. The idea is very clear. He wants to play king e4 and attack the pawn from behind. So we just stop him from doing that. We play king to f3. So far, white has played perfectly with absolute precision. How are you going to continue here? Black played king f6, and it's up to you. How will you continue here? Capablanca again played a very surprising move. He plays g4. So shouldn't white avoid exchanging pawns and pieces? In general, he should. It is actually preferable to avoid exchanging pieces when you are winning or you're aiming for a win. But you can see the problem is if you just go back a move, both these pawns are placed on dark squares and it's extremely difficult for white to unravel. Basically, the bishop is eyeing this pawn and it's very difficult for white to push forward without creating weaknesses. And that is the reason white is aiming to get one of his pawns out of the dark squares and free his position, free his king. And if that happens, then basically he can maybe at some point push forward with d6. So let's see what happens. Generally, black should play something like bishop to b6 and just wait around here. And this is the exact moment that where black made a mistake. Black made a huge mistake which cost him the game. So Alexander here, rather than waiting, it's not in his nature to wait, but rather play very proactively. It is in his style, which is nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you just need to wait forward. And bishop to b6 is actually asking white what are you going to do. Obviously, you cannot push forward because that will be premature. And I can play king to e6 forward by picking up the pawn. So it's not very clear what white is going to do. And that is the reason you should have just waited around. But black in this game played king to g5. This is actually a mistake. How will you exploit this mistake as white? So Capablanca in the game played the very nice move knight to e5, and this comes with a lot of tricks. There are again a bag of tricks. Generally in this kind of position, it's the knight which is preferable. It's knight which is better because the pawns are on specifically or one side of the board, more on one side of the board if you just neglect this pawn. And when the pawns are on one side of the board, it's a knight which is a better piece because the knight controls a lot of squares in a close range compared to the bishop. Bishop is a long range weapon, very strong, and that's very sad for a player like me because I prefer bishops. I love bishops, but in certain positions like this one, knight is obviously much better. So the threat is to capture the pawn, obviously. And if you just go something like king to f6, then here you see the point. Knight to d7 would be a fork. That will be a horrible move and would lose a piece. So obviously he cannot go back. What happens if f5? This too is actually losing. Capablanca found this was not played in the game, but here is a very nice resource from white. White can go forward and play d6. Beautiful move. If this is taken, then knight to f7 is the fork. So what happens if pawn takes pawn? Then white simply plays king to g2, not king to g3, because then something could happen along the diagonal. So bishop takes d6 is threatened here. That's the reason king to g2 is the more precise move. And again, he cannot take, and basically he will lose a piece if he tries to stop the pawn. So that would have been the result if f5 would have been played. But in the game, uh, the more careful move bishop d4 was played, which basically allows white to go for the other pawn. Now basically white is 2 pawns up and has much better chances, some serious chances of winning the game. So you can see from a very slight advantage, Capablanca beautifully converted his advantage and got this position. And this is simply wonderful against a player of uh, Alekhine's class. Alexander was not a kid. He was not a beginner. He was a genius, brilliant attacking player. He was a great player. Playing something like this just shows difference of class. These are the players of very highest class, both of them. But this just shows how the genius of Capablanca. So let's go forward. King f6 was played. What would you play here? White in this position played knight to d8, and this is simply a beautiful move. Uh, King to e5. Again, there are a bag of tricks. The knight is always full of tricks. King to e5 falls into knight to c6. That's a fork. And if king to e7, again knight to c6 would be a fork. That's a double attack. The bishop will drop off. So basically, white is beautifully defending all of the squares, again creating a wall. So black moves his bishop to b6, and white, sorry for that, he moves his bishop to b6, and white brings back his knight. And here you see the point again. The invisible wall is still there. Black king just cannot approach the pawn so easily. And let's see what happens. So bishop to b6 played, king to f4. Now white is saying, I've done enough waiting, I've got huge advantage, I can win, and I'm coming for it. So bishop takes f2. This was the only practical chance that black had, and he took it. Wow. Now white played g5 check, king moves back, and now knight check. And again, black has a choice. He can come to e7 as happened in the game, or he can go to g7. Going to g7 is actually very, very dangerous, because in that case I'll simply push forward the pawn. It's not easy at all to stop the pawn. If you play bishop to b6, then I'll still just play d7 and knight to c6, and that would win the bishop. So in general, king to g7 would be a suicidal move, and uh, in the game, king to e7 was played, giving up the pawn on g6 but trying to stop the more dangerous d5 pawn. So let's see what happens next. Knight to g6 was played. Now we go king to e6, king to e4, just protecting the pawn. Whenever possible, try to play defensive chess. If you have advantage, don't just hurry up. Don't be in a hurry to continue and win the game. That is always very important. The game is not over. Remind yourself that the game is not over. I always do it, and I've seen many other players do it. Whenever they have a huge advantage, they're up to the winning. That is the chance. That is the point where you mess up things, and that is the reason you just have to just be careful. Just wait around a minute. Just don't hurry. So bishop to g3 played, knight to f4. Trading this would not be a good idea, as this will end up in a completely winning endgame for white, and that is the reason black just played king to e7. And now here we go, king to e5, again daring black to take. This doesn't really make sense, because after king takes, white is completely winning. So he plays bishop to e1, and now we have d6 check, king goes over here, and here you have to be very precise. g6 is played, bishop to b4. What would you play here? I'll just ask you the question, what would you play here? Okay, I hope you didn't fall for Alexander's trick. Basically, if you're careless and you play g7, then bishop to c3 would actually be a draw, because he would pick up the pawn on g7, and then he would just sacrifice his pawn, bishop, for the other pawn. That would be something to avoid and very dangerous. So Capablanca was obviously careful about it. He was an experienced fighter. He was careful about it, and he plays king to d5. And if bishop takes pawn, then simply g7 wins. So black in this position played king to e7, king to e8, and here we have the final nail in the coffin. d7 check basically forces black to resign the game. White wins the game. If you just take, I'm going to show you what happens. If you just take, nobody can stop this pawn from queening. So this is completely winning. So this was absolutely phenomenal game. I found this game to be brilliant. Just the way Capablanca converted his advantage is simply brilliant. And his knight dance was absolutely beautiful. Whenever he created this this barriers with the king and with the knight and pawn, that was absolutely beautiful. And this is the reason why he was called as a genius, as a god of endgames, because this is completely beautiful performance, again a player of Alexander's class. So hope you've enjoyed this very instructive chess game. This was the 29 match game played between Capablanca and Alexander Alekhine in the Buenos Aires World Championship 1927. Thank you for watching, and by the way guys, do subscribe to my YouTube channel. A lot of videos are up on the way. So bye until next time.